ask you one question right now. What does history tell us you about Africa? Who discovered Africa? If you write right now on Google, who discovered Africa, you find out that it's one white man that he came and discovered Africa. And you can ask yourself, how can you discover a place that people already live in that place? It is impossible, but that's what the history tells us. That's what people believe about Africa, that it was discovered by a white man. This guy, he came, and then he went back, he gave a report, and then the next we know is colonialism, because those guys, they sat somewhere to divide Africa like a piece of cake, because they discovered it, they own it, it belonged to them. But that is us. We discovered, we're the first people to know. And today you have a lot of people around the world that they think that Africa was discovered by them.
Hello, hope you guys can hear me. Special welcome to my brothers and sisters of the Pan-African congregation. Welcome. It's a very beautiful night in here in the eastern coast of Africa, God's holy land. And yeah, man, today we're talking about decolonization. Very important topic. Welcome Regmon Music, welcome Ethiopian Tube, welcome Redwan Shafi, Mariette, Marie Antoinette, Regmon. Oh, let me not repeat your name. Who else? Kaizo is in the building. Yeah, I think I've gotten everybody. Welcome to the stream, my people. Today we're talking about something very important, very passionate to my heart, really. It's about us as Africans. Sometimes we might be colonized in the mind, and we might not even know. You know, a lot of us here we might have some colonial biases within our thought processes, within everything we do, and we not even notice, maybe because in our society it has normalized this thing. But today we're going to explore all this stuff. So first of all, let's start with a beautiful word of prayer. Okay, Heavenly Father, we come to you in your holy land, Africa. Thank you for everything you've done to us. We push for our intentions, for our decolonization, our education, and our thriving. In your holy name we pray and believe in. Amen. Welcome to the stream. So I don't know if you guys can hear me, first of all, or I'm talking to myself. I think, guys, can you confirm if you can hear me? Oh, okay, thank you. So, okay, today let me stop the screen, my fellow brothers and sisters, and share what we came here to really see. We're going to see some beautiful brothers and sisters from the continent talking about colonization the way they know best, you know?
The Kenyan flag went up. We were declared independent. But how independent is Kenya and indeed the rest of Africa? This is the question that we're asking today on our subject, neocolonialism. Why is it still a thing in Africa and who is to blame? But before we go too far, let's come to Nanjala, who is a political analyst and a writer here in Kenya. How would you describe neocolonialism? What does it mean to you?
I think that Kwame Nkrumah gave us the best definition for neocolonialism, which is late-stage imperialism. Because when we had direct imperialism, what you had is foreign countries having direct control, influence over people's economy, people's labor, people's freedom of speech, freedom of association. But with neocolonialism, what you have is indirect influence of political decision-making, of economic decision-making. That's how he defines neocolonialism. It's the benchmark for how we understand what's happening in a lot of the world that was sort of coming out of the colonial process.
Okay, I have a question.
That's a very beautiful definition from my sister here. Welcome, Redwan Shafit. I love you too. So this I have a it's a very beautiful definition from my sister here. Her name is Nanjali. She's very active in Twitter, and she describes herself as a public intellectual. But she talks about an influence, colonial influence in everything we do. You know, you may not know that there is colonial influence. You know, sometimes you might think, some people actually think some culture that came from colonialism is African culture, you know? And they don't see that, oh, wait, this comes from this is actually a form of neocolonialism. You know, some even might go ahead and argue that capitalism is a form of neocolonialism. But let us continue. Because the way she has defined it, I don't think I can define it any better. So today, just keep attention and we'll see.
In really early on.
You will see very beautiful minds, very beautiful African minds in the continent, talking about issues to do with Africa. I think this is something rare in Pan-African spaces from what I see. From what I've seen, it's very rare in Pan-African spaces to see Africans in the continent just speaking about colonialism, neo-colonialism, and Pan-Africanism. So today, guys, you're in for a treat.
And I think it's important that we address this. We are Deutsche Welle. This is Germany's international broadcaster. And I'm here as an African. Am I a function and a tool of neocolonialism?
Just because you moved from, let's say, an African station to like a wider broadcaster does not make you a tool for neocolonialism, only in the sense that your talent is letting you tell, like right now, a black story within a predominantly, assume, white dosh world. So that does not make you a tool. One becomes a tool when there are direct interest of a neocolonizer.
Okay, so let me come to the farmer right here, Mr. Michael Kibinge, because your farm, as you mentioned, is over 100 years old, certainly older than the nation of Kenya. Do you feel like you're beholden to the person who began this farm?
Absolutely not, Edith. There's a famous Kenyan author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote a book, Decolonizing the Mind.
Yes.
And
Okay, first of all, he's talking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o. For those who didn't hear, he's a very famous African author. For those who like to read African books, though that's like he's up there with Chinua Achebe. You gotta have Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He talks about, his book is called Decolonizing the Mind. Go search for it I think it's already online. It's everywhere. You can find it. It's a very good book. It's a very good insight from the African perspective of colonization. He's a very iconic writer in Africa.
I believe we need to both decolonize our minds and our hearts as Kenyans. 56 years plus after independence, we really shouldn't be complaining too much about neocolonialism. Within the context of the coffee subsector, 4 years ago, we started what is called coffee tourism. So we invite tourists to come and see how coffee is grown, how it's processed, and then they get an opportunity to taste our brands. And that allows us to charge a fee for the tourism component and sell our coffee on farm.
Okay. Let me come back to Nanjala, because I want to challenge...
This is where we begin the work. We begin the hard work of decolonization. We're not going to just be seeing this video. We're going to be talking the topics that they put up in this video. We're going to be going to them into depth. So he's talking about farming and cash crop farming. Now there are guys out there who because they see it in the West. They see it in the West and they think because it's in the West, it should work in Africa. That is a form of neocolonialism. You just don't know. It's just bias. But let's see, because it's also related to land grabbing.
To challenge you, basically, based on what Michael has said, that it's been about 56 years. We shouldn't be talking about neocolonization right now. Look at me and Fairview Farm. We're doing it on our own.
When we're talking about colonization and we're talking about imperialism, we're not talking about individual experiences. We're talking about a systemic issue. Yes, you're able to grow your coffee and run your coffee tours, but is the price, for example, that you're selling your coffee at reflective of the labor that has gone into producing that coffee, or is it reflective of political priorities that have been set elsewhere? Is it somewhere else saying that because you're an African country, your role is to produce, and especially to produce raw materials? And those are all questions of power and power disparities, and power disparities, exploitation of power disparities for the profit of certain regions, certain parts of the world, is the very definition of neocolonialism.
Okay, I'd like to come to Shefa because I just want to, piggyback on what Nanjala is saying, that it is a system and it is exploitative. But where are our politicians, the people who should be at those international?
Okay. Now she spoke. Let's talk about the farming part before we move on to the political leadership. Let's talk about the farming. So there are those who are in the school of thought that, hey, farming should be large scale, right? People are like, oh, small scale farming is primitive. That's what they say, that Africa should just stop small scale farming. They should move to large scale farming. So today, let me give you a book written called The Divide, written by an author from Swaziland. Of all the places, today we are going to Swaziland. Let me see let me stop sharing the screen. Let me share the screen of the book. Now the book is called The Divide. Here we are. Can you guys see it? I think you guys can see it. So here we are. The book is called The Divide. Let's talk. Let me see if they can get the author. Okay, can't get the author right now, but I'll get you. I'll post it later. Then there are land grabs right here from here. Let's just see if I can highlight this place over here. There. This is the place I'm reading from. Then there are land grabs. To put an end to land grabs, it will make sense to place a moratorium on deals that involve major land transfers from small farmers. You see, people don't understand that 5% of African land, is not even of African fertile land. Africa is a huge continent, but 5% of African fertile land is grabbed by the British and other European countries in the name of large-scale farming. People, that's a fact. You need to go and check. 5%, probably even more right now. This book is a little bit, maybe a couple of decades old, but that's the excuse neocolonialists use, that large-scale farming improves food security. But so you have a lot of large-scale farms owned by European companies in Africa, grabbed in the name of improving food security. But they don't do that. Africa is still in food insecure, right? Although we are solving that problem little by little. But in the end, the solution is not large-scale farming. It has never been large-scale farming, because that is a capitalist solution. Let's talk about this. Because many land grabs are made with an eye towards profiting and rising of food prices, to really get the root of this problem, we will require preventing financial firms and investors from speculating recklessly on food. Not only, oh my God, you could see this with the Ukrainian war and the Ukrainian-Russian war, how people are speculating on the price of wheat that will grow up, So guess what happens? So there'll be people, because of that, farmers. The biggest farmer probably in the United States is a billionaire called Bill Gates, right? Why is he doing that? Because he's speculating the price of food will come higher. So he's going to put extensive, large-scale farms. Let's continue. Not only will this remove the incentives that spur many of the most harmful land grabs, it will also keep food affordable and prevent needless hunger. There is also the matter of the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which has spurred land grabs in the name of reducing hunger, operating under the assumption that corporations can produce food more efficiently than small-scale farmers in the village. This is a fallacy, by the way. But by dispossessing small farmers, it paradoxically risks increasing But okay, here, but by dispossessing small farmers, they are paradoxically risking increasing hunger. The weight of evidence suggests that the best strategy to tackling hunger is in fact the opposite approach. Land reform in the favor of small farmers, small-scale farmers whose produce already feeds the vast majority of the world's progress. Basically, food crops. You know, these guys in the video were talking about cash crops, talking about coffee. But it's very funny that, and another point of neocolonization, that maybe they didn't even notice that they're in a country that is not food secure, but here they are talking about cash crops. They're talking about coffee, talking about tea. But in your own country, there is food insecurity. So it is an aspect of this is just a big aspect of neocolonialism. Oh my God, I'm even stammering this word. I've refused to be neocolonized. That's why. Not only will this remove. Okay, let me go back to the place. Indeed, that's how China eradicated so much hunger during the 1990s. So China actually embraced small-scale farming. That is one way China eradicated hunger. In 2014, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food affirmed this point, calling for strong protection against agribusiness land grabs and laws that ensure small farmers have rights to use, save, and exchange seeds. This is another thing, seed patenting, another thing that causes food insecurity. But here we are, because the West does it, because Mzungu says, Mzungu called Bill Gates, he says, you know what, this is the way. A lot of Africans think that's the way. So, because Bill Gates is pushing for, even he was in Kenya just the other day, pushing for seed GMOs, pushing for seed patenting, all this stuff that does not benefit the farmer, does not benefit the hungry African, but the corporation. So in the end of the day, if you still can't afford the food, because you will not be able, you'll still be hungry. Better the farmer who can feed himself with his small parcel of land and is going to grow food crops to feed himself and his village, because he's going to trade that food, than the large-scale farmer who is only producing food for export. He's not even producing food, he's producing coffee, he's producing cash crops. Okay, so yeah, that's just the end of that. Stop the screen. Go back to the video.
Tables, making better deals for us, saying this doesn't work for us anymore.
Kenya struggles with the cancer of political leadership that is dysfunctional, that is exploitative, that it's violent.
In parts of the world is the very definition of neocolonialism.
Okay, I'd like to come to Shefa, because I just want to, piggyback on what Nanjala is saying, that it is a system and it is exploitative. But where are our politicians, the people who should be at those international tables making better deals for us, saying this doesn't work for us anymore?
Kenya struggles with the cancer of political leadership that is dysfunctional, that is exploitative, that it's violent, that's discriminatory. There's also this culture that stems from a neo-colonial space of leadership that excludes people from their leaders, which is putting the people into this vicious circle of constantly saying, we need better, but nothing ever changes, because the bubble and the shield of neocolonialism is so thick.
So we're saying that, oh my goodness, that neocolonialism, once again, is seeping into basically every single factor of our lives, politically, economically, even how we think, socially. And Mordecai Ogada, I really want to know what your take is on that. So as a conservationist, you have a very unique idea, which is that even narratives around Africa have been hijacked by Westerners. Can you talk to me about this?
The neo-colony or the new colony is not necessarily a physical space. It's a mental space. And we are so deep in it that even our top government structures cannot sort of fathom how deep we are in it. That's why we have a Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife, because conservation is a principle and tourism is a business. Conservation of wildlife is about our heritage. It's not about tourism. But this shows where it grew from. We still have the feeling that wildlife tourism is something we do for white people.
So do you think that this is because we have internalized neocolonialism so much that we have become perpetrators of neocolonialism?
Precisely.
It seems you're not the only one. There's somebody here. In fact, there's someone clapping. But you're saying, yeah, we are responsible for the neo.
Okay, before this lady speaks, people tend to forget that when tourism, especially in Africa, African governments see when you see our culture as a tourist product. African governments don't see our culture as like heritage or something that we should preserve because it's our history and all that. Nah, it's actually seen. That's how it's taken, as a tourist product, yeah. I mean, if you look at even the Maasai getting evicted, the Maasai of Tanzania getting evicted from their own country in Tanzania, getting evicted from their own lands because tourists, because their population is not conducive for tourism. So because the tourists want to come to see the animals and they see a bunch of Maasai in the land, they get they get maybe they're not attracted to the Maasai like that. So what's happening is now in Tanzania right now, I don't know how the case went because I know the case was in the East African court, but now Tanzania is fighting for the eviction of people from their own indigenous lands, from their own ancestral lands, so that we can please some Saudi Arabian guy or somebody in the United Arab Emirates. Another one is another one in the mud is South Africa. I mean, the way South Africa treat their animals. I see a lot of non-indigenous Africans. Let me just put that, non-indigenous Africans playing around with animals like lions, like as if they are pets, putting cheetah, all these animals in cages, getting paid for people from the West to come to hunt these animals and get their trophies. And I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing? And they're doing that all in the name of conservation. All in the name of conservation. All that land, by the way, when you see a game reserve, just know that all that land was somebody's home. But now they have been chased away in the name of conservation. Even you could even see it even if you watch the one for I don't know this channel. I forgot the name of the channel. The channel for the Pan-African channel about the African Diaspora Network. Yeah, that's the name. But the one for Phil, he actually Wongel actually, she actually, even you also see her in the Swahili Nation, but in that channel, she talked about how the eviction of the people from the Samburu people. I don't know if the Samburu people. I think it's the Samburu people. How they were evicted from their lands, from the Lewa Conservancy, similar to the Maasai, in the name of preserving land. Even the prince here, actually, she also talked about the prince of England. His name is William. The Prince William, the way he talks about the conservation of Africa, how the population of Africa is affecting the animals, is negatively affecting conservation. The Prince of England actually said that the conservation efforts are being negatively affected by the high population of Africa. So you can see the neocolonialism within the tourism sector in Africa. It is something that has been documented. It's something that has been talked about in documentaries and in a lot of papers. You can just do a research, even the books. I think even this guy, Gabriel Ogada, is a very prominent intellectual. He writes about this stuff. I think he has a book or something. Let me see if I can get his name again. Here
even how we think, socially. And Mordecai Ogada, I really want to know.
Mordecai Ogada. Yeah. He's one of those guys. He's on Twitter, I think. You should follow him he's on social media. You should follow him if you want to know about Africans. In this video, you're going to know a lot of people who you should actually follow if you want to know about the issues of Africa, because they are very active and they're very vocal, especially with this issue. So let's continue.
That we are experiencing.
Whenever
it seems you're not the only one. There's somebody here. In fact, there's someone clapping. But you're saying, yeah, we are responsible for the neocolonialism that we are experiencing.
Whenever I'm having a conversation about neocolonialism, I want to start with decolonize thy mind, because it's all in the mind. I'm an LGBTQ person. And most of the time when I sit and look at the history of LGBTQ people, when our
Yeah, don't mind that. That's yeah, that's also neocolonialism, right? If you look at LGBTQ, I think that is also a point of neocolonialism, because I think the alphabet people, to me, that's European culture. I have actually tried to search of instances in which this practice was done in Africa, and I failed to find any documentation. Like I don't know where they usually there are some insinuation. I've heard they're trying to say the king of Baganda. I don't know, some former king of Baganda. There's some sort of insinuation about that, but there is no real hardcore evidence or somebody actually coming to say. It's just conjecture. So to me, the way she starts like that already, to me, I feel like she's already neocolonized, but she carries a heavy point nonetheless.
colonialists came into our country, they came with the laws and the constitution, which until today is still guiding us. But before that, we had our ways in which we did things. But you see, all these things are things that we were taught and then we internalized. And we started saying now, because this law came and it told us this, these are our new realities. But are they our realities? I'm not a Western person. I was born in Kenya, raised in Kenya. My realities are all from Kenya as a Kenyan child, as a child of this soil. But every other time, I have had to unlearn a lot of things to even accept my truth as a queer person.
So we'll get to the realpolitik around that in just a second. But I want to introduce Mutua Madheka now, because as a photographer, you've gone around the continent of Africa with your very fantastic project, if I may say, Unscrambling Africa. You know, when you hear it said here that it's just a simple, we'll get to the
time I have had things. But you see, all these things are things that we were taught and then we internalized, and we started saying, but you people, when our colonialists came into our country, they came with the laws and the constitution, which until today is still guiding us. But before that, we had our ways in which we did things. But you see, all these things are things that we were taught and then we internalized, and we started saying now, because this law came and it told us this, these are our new realities. But are they our realities? I'm not a Western person. I was born in Kenya, raised in Kenya. My realities are all from Kenya as a Kenyan child, as a child of this soil. But every other time, I have had to unlearn a lot of things to even accept my truth as a queer person.
So we'll get to the realpolitik around.
So I don't know. It sounds like, I don't know if you guys can hear this person clearly. It sounds like as if there is a little of is it choppy? It sounds a little bit choppy. I don't know if you guys can hear it properly. But she talks about something that's very heavy. That she was born in Kenya, and she was born and raised in Kenya. So her reality is Kenyan. So that's a very heavy topic that we're going to talk about. A few, just
But I want to introduce Mutua Madheka now, because as a photographer, you've gone around the continent of Africa with your very fantastic project, if I may say, Unscrambling Africa. You know, when you hear it said here that it's just as simple as decolonizing the mind, but I'm just wondering, how important are perceptions? How important is who controls the narrative? And is that shifting?
So one of the most important things, I think, is that African artists, photographers, whatever they are, need to look more inside than outward while looking for inspiration for their work. Because most of the time you'll find that when we are guided by things like grants and fellowships, you'll find that anytime you look, somebody, probably someone white, somewhere deciding, I want to give grants to African photographers to look at a certain topic, but a topic that I am interested in, not something that they're interested in. Earlier, you did mention about this being on DW, and the idea that journalism and news and all that we were taught by the West. That means all our journalistic photography seeks to look like the journalistic photography. That means pictures by a KTN photographer will look like pictures by a DW photographer. Why? It's unnecessary. They are not the same people. They're not working in the same context. So I think the stories should be different.
Okay, Nanjala, I just want to come to you so that you can contextualize this for us. Why is this so important? Why is it important that artists, journalists who are within the continent of Africa are self-actualized, that they don't use the West as a model?
You know, we talk about consciousness. It's about the consciousness with which we move through the world. Are we moving through the world confidently assured of our place, our value, and our contribution to society? Or are we moving through the world with a consciousness that is somehow crippled, that we think that we are less than, and so we have to spend the rest of our lives trying to reassert our humanity.
And I'm just wondering from Tony, is this possible on a political sphere? I mean, I think we all heard the former AU ambassador to the US being very, very angry about the fact that some French countries still operate under a CFA. In what ways does neocolonialism still have an impact in the way we're governed?
I mentioned the French very briefly. The French have never mentally left Africa, ever. You can see what goes on with the Congolese. Like, the highest glory of African evolution is to become a Frenchman or a mademoiselle. The French have never lost that mentality. But
one might argue that Kenyans have not lost that mentality. We are, after all, having this conversation in English.
No, but Kenya is a very different country. We may be confused there, but I want to address immediately our political leadership. All neocolonialism relies on somebody having the leader in their pocket. Look at the begging bowls we always have whenever Xi Jinping in Beijing calls.
In that case, is your gripe then with your own government or with the colonial government that created structures in which we are governed as we are?
That is very lazy. We're always trying to blame the British in 2020. We are always trying. All the time we keep complaining about all white people, by which we mean European people. The truth is this. Right now in 2020, Edith, 2020, February 20, the neocolonizer is China.
All right, I'd like to get some more views on this side.
The problem came with the philosophical foundations of this country. Like, if we're talking about export, we didn't center Kenyans or the people who live in this land we are in. So what we're experiencing now is a result of what happened then. So the West is still to blame, but we reproduce what they did. They're to blame, but we are reproducing it. We internalized it. So we shouldn't really center them whenever we think about development. We shouldn't think about this being a tourist destination. We should be thinking about how we're going to eat, how we're going to make this country better.
That's a really good point. Any other person?
Yeah, so he makes a very poignant point, a very delicious point. Let me try to expound on it. He's talking about the bourgeoisie, the rich Africans, really, not just the Kenyans, the rich Africans. You see, once the rich Africans in the colonial government got rich out of being Christians and serving the white man. So when the Mzungu left, they still continued their process of getting rich by serving or being the intermediary between the Mzungu and the Mwafrika. So that's what the rich are. Even right now, we look at the richest Africans. The richest come from being in the government. There are a lot of the richest Africans are just politicians who have government connections, who are intermediaries between the Western capital and Africans on the ground. You know, there are some government officials who have to sign off on investments, or who have the connections to Africans, or have the connections to labor or means of production. So that's not genuine wealth. You know, being an intermediary is not genuine wealth. That's why they are not the rich. You know, they're not captains of industry, like maybe you'll find maybe in the West. Although this is also maybe a form of neocolonialism, but they're not captains of production. They don't have any means. They don't have the means of production the way the West has. You see, the other day in the Congo, there was this magic stone in the Congo that sparks and produces electricity. They know very few, if they even exist, African companies can utilize that. You know, but we know hundreds of Western companies that will find that valuable, and they can do this they can put this in their batteries, battery production, in their electric cars, in their fridge. You know, but how many African countries have that capability? How many African wealthy people became wealthy because of that capability? So we are even unable to exploit our own resources because of this. So I think that is his biggest point. He put it a little bit differently, but I think that was what he was trying to say.
Who wants to add on that?
Okay, I think the way Africans have always grown up, we always think that our problems can only be solved by the whites. Like, we have been blinded. Let's try to solve our problems on our own, because the whites, they want to make you feel that they are the people who can solve your problems.
Okay, but is it fair? Let me ask Schaefer here. Is it fair to sort of lump the whole Western world into, you know, they're the white saviors, they're trying to come and save us, we don't need their help? Is there room for collaboration, or is it just going to be this bipolar dialogue?
Well, I think room for collaboration that existed or that have been assumed to exist has existed in their white terms. So even as we collaborate, we are collaborating within their own structures, within their own agreements, within their own engagements, within their own requirements, right? White people have always wanted to enforce and to carry forward their whiteness and their supremacy. We should be able to enforce and carry forward our blackness, our black supremacy. But it's never going to happen because we don't have the leadership that is capable to reimagine our own governance and engagements out of the frame that is not neo-colonial.
Angela, but is it necessary to always have this white resentment? There's a game we are playing here, and sometimes I get tired of it. They say, oh, I want to take white grants, that I want something specific to us. Your government never, I've won a lot of these scholarships and so on. They're always white. But you tell your own story in your own way. I feel like, what's this white resentment? I'll never be sad about being colonized by the British, of all the colonizers, because history and, you know, we had this.
Please contextualize that.
I will never be sad because that's the way, real politics of the way of history. Had we been colonized like by the Belgians, they didn't give a damn. But I'm not going to go and keep repenting about 1889. So,
okay.
so do you understand my point?
So yes. And I'd like to give, let me come to Schaefer because she's so exhausted. Her hands are on her head.
I'm about to give up. Because the thing is this, right? So the context is when I hear people talk about they don't have a problem with having been colonized, I question how deep are you in this neo-colonial struggle that you've actually embraced your abuser and made her feel that she was right for doing what they did to you.
Tony is saying that the facts can't be changed, that the world order at the time was as it was.
The world order was white people stealing from black Africans. That was the world order. I think sometimes we speak very carelessly and very casually about very fundamental things that have got us in the mess that we are, and I really don't appreciate it.
Okay, Tony, do you agree with the charge that you are so deeply neo-colonized yourself that you don't see why your utterances could have been?
That is absolute bollocks. Yeah. Let me use British language. So people say I'm more neo-colonized. That is bollocks. Because we are educated in this way. Yeah, it's like those people who fail in life and keep talking about, oh, their father was an alcoholic or their mother never loved them enough. And we like that. We must lose the victim mentality about the British especially, which we have in this country.
We started with a very critical question. Neo-colonialism, why is it still in Africa? Well, the answer is in our history. And who is to blame for it? Apparently, we all are. Thank you for watching.
So yeah, so that last guy is where I wanted us to let me drink my coffee. So yeah, that last part is where I wanted us to really emphasize on the neo-colonized African. You know, some people, a lot of you can even see them here in the YouTube circles. A lot of them are. Let me see if I can share this. Some people, you can see them in the YouTube circles. They are neo-colonized Africans. Like, you can even see the way they talk and the way they speak. They speak badly about Africans. They speak as if Africans are some sort of disease or some sort of infants. You know, they infantilize Africa the way they speak about Africa. And they feel like that makes them special. That makes them superior. But I'm here to tell you, I'm here to show you, my Pan-African congregation, that this behavior of talking down about Africa, literally this guy worshipping the British, instead of talking about how the British were great to invade us or to colonize us. This type of thing is not new. It's not new and it's not special. The first person to come up with this idea, these ideas have been there since even before colonization. So let me show you one instance, and this is in the 60s. This is just completely fresh after independence. You can see this type of idiots. And it's a book actually not written by an African. I think it was written by a British, North of South, by oh my God. For those who like For the title is North of South. I don't think you can find it anywhere. It's North of South, it's something called Shivji or something like that. But let me just read it. You are getting terribly Victorian. Okay, let's go back. The possibility, I should he began to rail peasants, influence. This is about a woman called Wamalwa. Now the battle against had become part of parcel of the battle for civilization, providing powerful argument that the preservation of the status quo. The White Highlands, the Mau Mau had reacted by agitating against soil conservation programs. Soil conservation programs. Joe, in effect, had to take up the white man's burden. Okay, this is not the guy I wanted. I think it's over here. Okay, now we're going to the story of a woman called Mrs. Wamalwa. She lived around the 60s. She was Kenya was fresh from independence. She was educated by the British. She's one of the first crew of bourgeoisie in the independent Kenya. She was amongst the first people of the bourgeoisie in the independent Kenya. But look at how she talks, and you will realize that there are a lot of similarities by the way some Africans talk today. You know, and I like this because it's taken from a perspective of somebody from outside, from a worldly perspective, not an African who was writing this. So we will see how cringe it is when you talk down about your own homeland or talk down against your own people. You think you look good, but the world does not even see you with that level of respect that you think you get, you know. So I don't know what to say. I appreciate it. Where is it? Let me look for it. There are two Africans. Where I think it was here. No, she was traveling to London. Prehistoric machine. Well, there was a part where she was just talking down on Africa. I thought I put it here. Yeah. Guys are going to have to bear with me as I look for it here. Where is she? Okay, I don't think I'm going to find it right now, but let me just go to the part where I saw the Africanization. Oh yeah, here. I found it. So it's right here. The man had owned the estate before me, had gone bankrupt or something like that. And one day, this is Mrs. Wamalwa, and one day he just disappeared into the blue. What happened next doesn't bear thinking about it. Now, this is an African woman, Kenyan woman. Look at how she talks. Look at her language. The locals moved in. Now, you are a local. You as an African, you are a Kenyan woman, you are a local. But because you are stuck up that colonial behind that you can't even see the way the language you talk, and you see this even in Pan-Africans, not Pan-Africanists because they're not genuinely Pan-Africanists, but you can see it even in some lost Africans right now. The way they speak about Africa, they speak as if they're not Africans. Like you talk about Africans are low IQ, or Africans are not are thieves, or Africans are, and you're like, aren't you an African? Have you forgotten that you are an African? What type of disease is this? What type of amnesia is this? What type of who do you think you're impressing? Who the hell do you think you're impressing? The locals moved in and divided it up. Now she's talking about the locals. The locals moved in and divided it up among themselves. You know what they are like. Literally, she's talking about what they are like. And she's talking to white people. She's not talking to an African is talking negatively about Africans to Mzungus. And he's like, oh, you know how these Africans are like. Jesus Christ. The amount of cringe. She widened her eyes in a conspiratory way at Bati. There must have been half a dozen families living here. Naked totos running about and peeing everywhere. Toto means children. So she's really talking down on, like, oh, naked children, naked African children just running around here, uncivilized, peeing everywhere. Like, and this is how, till today, the African bourgeoisie see Africa. Their fellow. It's like, do you look at the mirror? It's like when they look at the mirror, they don't see Africans. Just because you got the British accent, just because you've got the European accent, you think you're not African, that you can talk down on your fellow Africans because maybe they are poorer than you, that you see them as, that you can even talk down on them in front of the Mzungu. Let's continue. It was horrible. Closing her eyes shuddered. Even now, I have nightmares whenever I think about it. They used to make their cooking fires in this very room. The ceiling was black with soot and grease. Huge chunks of plaster had fallen out. They'd even chopped up doors and furniture to make firewood. Vandalism. Guess, look at the Mzungu. The Mzungu is just encouraging her to continue to talk like that. Vandalism, Joe said. He adjusted his golfing cap. What is one to do with such people? And Yani the Mzungu is also, Yani the Mzungu is just with you. He's encouraging your mediocrity. Like, the vandalism, such people. Yeah, and you don't see that in his eyes, he sees you as those people. So the Mzungu is actually trolling you. You think he sees you differently because you're insulting your fellow African. The term these days maybe might be cunning or other funny behavior, but the Mzungu, he still sees an African, so he's going to laugh. He's laughing at you, but you think he's laughing at the other Africans. People might think I'm extravagant spending so much money to restore this place, but I feel like if you decide to do something if you decide to do something, you must do it properly. I don't believe in half measures. No way. That's because there's a lot of jealousy, believe you. Where do you think, where did you pick this little gem up? Now, this woman has this house and she has fashioned it into such a way that it looks like as if it's in Britain, because she went to London that one time and she even claims that everything she imports is from London. Furniture. Africa has African hardwood is one of the best hardwood out there. Mahogany, when you hear about mahogany, that's African hardwood. But you're importing furniture just to look like you're part of the culture, the part of the white culture. Let's look at this sad story. Where did in London, and she says it very, very proudly. Where did you pick this up? She says, in London, on my last trip. Now, this is in the 60s. This is a woman, go check out Mrs. Wamalwa in the 60s. This prehistoric machine brings back she's talking about some sort of record player or something. So a uniformed maid announced that lunch was ready. Now she has a maid that is an African, obviously. Alberta led her way down the corridor into the dining room. Here, too, the furniture was madly of antique inspiration, but framed reproduction of the works of the Impressionist masters of William Morris, some sort of British guy. Basically, she was copying British furniture or something, British decorum, British interior design. That's what she was having. But this is in Africa, in a place called Nakuru, which is in Kenya. So basically British interior design. Then she goes, this is how it must have been in these houses in the old days. Now this is a Mzungu saying, this is why I like. So the Mzungu is enjoying because his culture. This is his culture. So he's enjoying, and then he gets to insult Africans in front of you. He's really enjoying himself. Okay, Albert acknowledged, and she saw it as a compliment. Albert acknowledged the compliment. So the Mzungu gave her a compliment. This is like British, and that compliment, she got the widest smile. These are people who really need to be impressed, who are looking for white gratification. these are neo-colonized. We're talking about decolonizing the mind. So this is a neo-colonized people. So it's a whole story about the dinner they had. This is page. Okay, I can't get the page, but it's 44%. I don't know why my reader just gives me percentages instead of the page. But there's a part she goes and says, that she was complaining that her school in Parklands has an African teacher. Now she's even complaining that there are African teachers in her school. Now this is an independent Kenya, so obviously there will be now more Africans taking up positions that were not taken. You know, Kenya people don't understand, but Kenya used to be an apartheid state before independence, where Africans were confined to specific regions and they could not even go to teach. They could not. A lot of Kenyans, especially in the Mau Mau, were actually put in concentration camps. So here now it's independent. Africans are getting educated. I think it's about 10 years after independence, or maybe 8 to 10 years after independence. So some Africans have been educated. They are now becoming teachers. They're taking up roles. She's complaining. She's complaining, but she has benefited from independence. So it's a dilemma that people like her are in. I did not know what to say. I appreciated that for people like her. In fact, this is another way Mzungu saying, Africanization has been a mixed blessing. On one hand, it had given her access to a farm in the White Highlands. On the other, it was ruining the education of her daughters because Africans are teaching her daughters. So she gets the benefit. She wants to be a white person, but she doesn't want Africans to... Literally, it's a very interesting perspective. When I read this book, I was like shocked. We have only one African teacher in their parklands speaking up in the defense of a school. Not true. So these people are arguing. It's a whole party, and the Mzungos are arguing that in my school there's just only one. No, you're lying. And so the more African teachers in your school, the lower the quality of education. That's what they're trying to imply. Now this guy, the writer of the book, is saying it was unnerving to listen to them talking about Africans as if they were referring to a species of humanity utterly distant from themselves, utterly distinct from themselves. So the art of the book was like, nobody will forget that you're an African. No matter what you do, your skin will always betray you. Like nobody will forget. No matter how you act, no matter what accent you have, no matter how badly you talk about your fellow Africans, nobody will forget that you are an African. I'm hoping to send Beatrice to boarding school. I heard in Lincolnshire. Okay, now she wants to send her children to the UK. If she likes it, Emma will follow. And when all is done, you can't beat real English education. So yeah, that's the end of the page. But in the end of the day, you can see how this what is it? Dusty. Not just to say dusty, but people who have pungent insecurities. You know, who these people, because of their insecurities and the way they talk badly about Africans, even here in modern day YouTube, you'll see it. And they think they're special. They think that what they're saying is new. It's not new. What they are saying, black people like them have always existed since before. And even since then, they were always viewed with a level of cringe, with a level of stupidity. Like even the person you're trying to impress is not impressed because you're talking down on your own race. That in the name of some even hide in the name of intelligence. Like, I'm being intelligent when I call African thieves, I'm trying to confront a problem. You know, hiding behind all this, the same way she's hiding behind all that. But in the end of the day, you're not fooling anybody but yourself. Really, that's all I have to say. And you know, this is a woman. So imagine how it would look like if it was a man saying this. It will even be worse. My brothers and sisters of the Pan-African congregation, man, stay away from these dastards. Let's see. Oh yeah, Shiva Naipoi. Let's see if I can remove this. There we are. So yeah, basically that. My point is just we should be very careful with who we talk to. Let's go to the next point, and this is a very interesting point from Frantz Fanon. For those who know him, he's a decorated author. He also talks about neocolonialism, especially in the diaspora, because now I also, because I've noticed this also. So where is this? Where is this? The book is called The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon. Let me see if I can share it. It's not showing up in the, yeah. Okay, here it is. So here we are, page. Going to have to mind with me. This is my first stream in a while, so I'm a bit slow in loading this stuff up, but don't worry, man, don't worry. We're getting better as we continue. Page 214, 207. There we are. So in this chapter, we shall analyze the problem which is felt to be fundamental, the legitimacy of the claims of a nation. So he goes about, this guy talks about, he begins, let me see where he begins. He talks about the culture. So he talks about the diaspora, really. And he talks about, okay, in fact, he goes even further and calls them the colonized. So inside the political parties, often in the offshoots of these parties, cultured individuals of the colonized race make their appearance. The cultured individuals of the colonized race. For these individuals, the demand for a national culture and formation of the existence of such a culture represent a specific battlefield. While the politicians situate the actions in actual present-day events, men of culture take their stand in the field of history. Confronted with the native intellectual who decides to make an aggressive response to colonial theory and pre-colonial barbarism, colonialism will react only slightly, and still less because the ideas developed by young colonized intelligentsia, basically the public intellectuals, are widely professed by specialists in the mother country. It is in this fact a commonplace to state that for several decades, large numbers of research workers in the main have rehabilitated the African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilization. So basically, the intellectuals from, I think this talks about the intellectuals. Welcome, Bitter Medicine podcast, my brother. So he talks about the intellectuals in the motherland. I think this talks about the colonial the colonial intellectuals pushing for the rehabilitation of the African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilization. So the passion in which these guys defend their existence of the national culture may be a source of amazement. But those who condemn this exaggerated passion are strangely apt to forget that their own psyche and their own selves are conveniently sheltered behind a French and German culture, which has given full proof of it. Okay, when this book was written, the word neocolonialism wasn't created. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't created yet. So what he's talking about is basically neocolonialism, but now he's just given the definition that the guys who protest the existence of a national culture are conveniently sheltered behind French or German culture, which has given full proof of its existence and which is uncontested. So at the beginning of the diaspora's path, he has fully embraced Western culture. Like that is the beginning. Before even that is the beginning of his path. He's fully Western. Maybe it's in his youth. Maybe now he sees Western culture as the superior culture. And as the guy who just shown in the video, he said that he's Western. You know, he's glad that he's colonized by the British. You know, that is the beginning of the path. So now the wave of Pan-Africanism pushes now, you know, it becomes a wave. Pan-Africanism becomes a wave, and all of a sudden it's cool to be African now. It's not disgusting to be African. It's not ashaming to be African. All of a sudden that the wave of Pan-Africanism pushes. So now the guy who had originally embraced Western culture because he was ashamed to be African and he sees Western culture as superior, is now in this dilemma where, let me put it here. Let me see where yeah, reading this stuff. Just found it here. So here it begins, okay? So because of that wave, this guy is filled with anxiety because now the African intellectuals, now there's a rise of now native intellectuals, you know, because the native intellectual now have become more than the, what is it? Is it the diaspora intellectual or the guy who had fully embraced Western culture? So because of this wave, they are in danger of losing their lives and becoming lost to Africans, to their own people. So these men, he talks about them, these men hot-headed and with anger in their hearts, relentlessly determined to renew contact once more with the oldest and most pre-colonial springs of life of their people. So now this guy is now double back to now African culture. And you will see this you will see this in a lot of YouTube channels, because this is something I've been going to YouTube. I've been going to a lot of YouTube channels and I've been listening to them. You will see this. You will see like guys who are just pre-colonial Africa, talking about the time when Africa lived in spear, romanticizing those times. And you have to understand their path. So they were there because they had at some point they embraced Western culture, but because they are angry, because now the African intellectual has risen up, now it's no longer embarrassing to be African. It's no longer ashaming to be African. Now they are doubling back into African culture, hardcore, you know, pre-colonial African culture, determined in an attempt to renew contact that he had lost. The contact that he had lost with his heritage, with his origin, with his people, is now trying to renew it. So let's continue. Let's go further. Perhaps this passionate research and this anger are kept up, or at least directed, by the secret hope of discovering beyond the misery of today, beyond the self-contempt, the resignation, and the abjuration. Fancy words, some very beautiful, he hopes to discover some very beautiful, splendid era whose existence rehabilitates us, both in regard to ourselves and regard to others. I have said that I have decided to go further. Perhaps unconsciously, the native intellectuals, since they could not stand wonderstruck before the history of today's barbarity, decided to back further and delve deeper down. And let us not make no mistake, it was with the greatest delight. Now, sometimes also I feel like it's talking about me, because it was with the greatest delight that they discovered that there was nothing to be ashamed of the African past, but rather dignity, glory, and solemnity. So, because at first the diaspora intellectual or even the African, the colonized African, as he calls them, had believed that his past was disgusting, and it's just a bunch of Africans yelling "Buga, uga, uga, buga, uga, buga." When he discovers that no, but because of the wave of Pan-Africanism, and now he goes and researches, and he discovers, oh, there was actually nothing to be ashamed of, and that his people lived actually with dignity. He is filled with delight. Let's continue. Oh God, I've lost it again. Oh no. Yeah, here we are. So, the claim to a national culture in the past does not only rehabilitate that nation and serve as a justification for the hope of a future national culture. In the sphere of psycho-effective equilibrium, it is okay. There's a lot of big words in this book. I tend to just brush over them just to get to my point. But perhaps we have not sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not simply content to impose its rule upon the present and the future of a dominated country. Colonialism is not satisfied with merely holding a people on its grip and emptying its natives' brain of all form of content. Denying you, and a lot of Africans don't even, this is why don't even know, and I can tell you this, I can testify to this. A lot of Africans don't know about life before colonialism. They don't. A lot of Africans are unaware, and it's by design. But by a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts and disfigures it and destroys it. This work of devaluing pre-colonial history takes on a dialectical significance today. When we consider the efforts made to carry out the cultural estrangement of characteristic of the colonial epoch, we realize that nothing has been left to chance, and the total result looked by colonial domination was indeed to convince the natives that colonialism came to lighten their darkness. So that past video of that guy who was praising British colonialism, this is the narrative he was fed. That because he doesn't know his past before colonialism, he thinks that colonialism came to lighten the burden of his people. He's still on the beginning of his journey. He will soon realize, because of the wave of Pan-Africanism will force him to realize that, oh wait, there is actually a history of my people living with dignity and solemnity, and so he will also, he will now be delighted and stick to that history. Some people are in different levels of decolonization. I think that's one of the big points we need to catch up. Some people are in different levels of decolonization. So if you continue to read this, you probably find where you are. The effect consciously sought by colonialism was to drive into the natives' heads that the idea that if the settlers were to leave, they will at once fall back into barbarism, degradation, and bestiality. So once again, we talk about those guys who talk negatively about Africans and think that if the white man were to leave, Africans will just fall into chaos. I'm not gonna lie, at some point I also used to think like that. So it's not a unique thing. Also me, I used to, at some point, I remember feeling like this until I got, a little bit decolonized in my journey. So on the unconscious plane, colonialism therefore did not seek to be considered by the native as a gentle, loving mother who protects her who protects her child from a hostile environment, but rather as a mother who unceasingly restrains her fundamental perverse offspring from managing to commit suicide and giving free rein to its evil instinct. You see, so the narrative of the narrative of all colonialist powers is that without us, that the African is naturally a beast, and that we are containing, that is the narrative of colonialism. And if you see somebody trying to push that narrative, you can easily tell that this is somebody who is still in the colonial mindset. That without the Mzungu, Africans would become, apes. That we are being held back from our natural ape-like instincts. Let's continue. In such a situation, the claims of the native intellectual are not a luxury, but a necessity in any coherent program. The native intellectual who takes up arms to defend his nation's legitimacy and who wants to bring proofs to bear out that legitimacy, who is willing to strip himself naked to study the history of his body, is obliged to dissect the heart of his people. So it's talking about the journey of the native intellectual. Such an examination is not specifically national. The native intellectual who decides to give battle to colonial lies fights on the field of the whole continent. The past is given back its value. Culture extracted from the past to be displayed in all its splendor is not necessarily that of his own country. So this is talking about Pan-Africanism, where people are celebrating, even here in East Africa, we are celebrating the past of West African, even you can see it, we're celebrating the past kingdoms, the past empires of all over Africa, including Egypt. So the past is given back its value. Doesn't necessarily need to be your specific past, but the past of Africa as a continent. Because this agenda of colonialism was not against just you, it was against the Black African as a whole. Culture, okay, let me not repeat that. Colonialism, which has not bothered to put too fine a point on its effort, has never ceased to maintain that the Negro is a savage. And for colonists, the Negro was neither Angolan or Nigerian, for he simply spoke of the Negro. So I think he's talking about a big mistake the colonialists made back then that ultimately came to be one of the weapons of Pan-Africanism, is that because the Mzungu himself did not differentiate Africans. He did not differentiate. To him, black people were black people. Africans were African. The Negro was just the Negro. He did not go ahead and differentiate the Negro, although there are some people specifically from the specific section of Africa who do not feel like they're Negroes. And that's a whole nother page or a whole nother topic. But because he spoke of the Negro, this had an effect he didn't foresee. That now, because of that, you united a whole people, because now people can, because we are all Negroes, the past of South Africa is a pride to all of us, because we are all Negroes now. So it became a uniting factor to Africans. And because of that, we're taking pride in all of Africa. Not just, our country did this, our country did that. This is why you can see the first leaders of Africa, the first Pan-Africanists, the likes of Nkrumah. They were all Pan-African. They were all taking pride in all parts of Africa. So, Frantz Fanon, he was alive. He was writing this book during that time. So he knew more than us. Okay. So colonialism condemnation, the condemnation of colonialism is continental in scope. The contention of colonialism that the darkest night of humanity lay over pre-colonial history concerns the whole of the African continent. The effort of the native to rehabilitate himself and to escape from the claws of colonialism are logically inscribed from the same point of view that of colonialism. So the native intellectual who has gone far beyond the domains of Western culture, and this is now they're talking about the diaspora, and who has got it into his head to proclaim the existence of another culture, never does so in the name of Angola or the Dahomey. The culture which is affirmed is African culture. The Negro, never so much a Negro as since he has been dominated by the whites. When he decides to prove that he has a culture and to behave like a cultured person, he comes to realize that that history points out a well-defined path to him. He must demonstrate that the Negro culture exists. So now there was pressure to demonstrate that the African culture, because the white blanketed Africa as a whole, now the Africans, obviously the opposite and exact pressure by Africans is to prove that African culture exists. So, and it is only too true that those who are the most responsible for this racialization of thought, or at least for the first movement towards that thought, are and remain those Europeans. So the fathers, it's a very bold claim, but he claims that the fathers of Pan-Africanism are actually Europeans. That if they had not blanketed Africa as a whole continent of darkness and lack of culture, then Africa will not be united and see itself as one people. It's a very bold claim. I agree with him though. So Europeans who have never ceased to set up white culture to fill the gap left by the absence of other culture. Colonialism did not dream of wasting its time in denying the existence of one national culture after another. Therefore, the reply of the colonized people will be straight away continental on its breadth. It's just talking about the same point. In Africa, the native literature of the last 20 years is not national literature, but an example of Negro literature. The concept of negritude, or for example, was emotional, if not logical, antithesis of that insult in which the white man flung at Africans, at humanity. This rush of negritude against the white man's contempt showed itself in certain spheres to be one idea capable of lifting interdictions, and I don't know these words, fancy words. if I reach a fancy word, I just say it, fancy words. Because the New Guinean and Kenyan intellectuals found themselves above all up against general ostracism. I think it's just insulting, basically being insulted, delivered to the combined contempt of their warlords. Their reaction was to sing praises in admiration of each other. So what happens is now, the intellectuals, this is why I always encourage guys to read about Africa, read African scholars, what their work, especially the old ones. You will find it very interesting, because now what he's saying is that Kenyan intellectuals ended up praising maybe Ghanaian intellectuals or Guinea intellectuals, and Guinea intellectuals were praising Kenyan intellectuals, Tanzanian intellectuals. They were each praising each other because of the insults that they were given by the white man, that the Negro has no culture. You know, the Negro, basically they were ostracized by the Mzungu. So now, because as a result, they end up encouraging each other. They end up motivating each other, trying to big up each other's self-esteem. And that is the origin of African literature within the 20 years before and after independence, probably before independence, the 20 years before independence, because I think this book was written in the 60s or in the 50s. I think it was so between 1930 to 1950s to 60s. The literature of Africa was just African intellectuals praising each other and praising Africa. I think, in fact, Big E, I don't know if he's here, but Big E was Big E at one point was actually talking about this, because he talked about how when he went to Kenya, there used to be a lot of motivational African songs. And one of the songs that I thought were just Kenyan, turns out that a lot of these songs were Pan-African. going through African, but I thought they were Kenyan. One of them was which one? Malaika. I think, yeah, hello Tanzan. I think we noticed even in Tanzan's channel that we're talking about this song about Malaika. Even the diaspora, well, knew Malaika, nakupenda Malaika. You know, these songs were all over. You know, were pushed all over Africa to big up in the incentive to promote African culture, basically. So it is if you talk to an old guy or somebody who is a little bit elder, he will tell you all these things. It's another thing you guys should do: talk to elders, talk to African elders, and read African books of the past. Also current books, but just read African books. You'll learn a lot. So let me go to on the whole, the poets of negritude opposed the idea of an old Europe to a young Africa, tiresome reasoning to lyricism, oppressive logic to high-stepping nature, and on one side, stiffness, ceremony, etiquette, skepticism, while on the other, frankness, liveliness, liberty, and why not? The poets of negritude will not stop at the limits of the continent. From America, Black voices will take up the hymn of a fuller unison, the Black world. The Black world will see the light from Busia, which is in Western Kenya, to Ghana, to Birago Diop, to Senegal, to Sudan, to Chicago. The Black world. Now here comes the Black world. The example, okay, and here's the funny thing, people don't know much about the Arab world, but something similar happened with the Arab world because they also went through a similar trauma as Africans. If surprisingly, people don't know this, but Arabs actually also went through a similar trauma. So they also had their answer, and that was the Arab world that went through all over from North Africa to the Middle East. So the struggle for national liberty was accompanied by a cultural phenomenon known as the awakening of Islam. Yeah, this is the world. This is the Arab world. Let's skip the Arab world though. Let's go back to Africa. At the same time, that spontaneous where was I? There was therefore the historical necessity in which the men of African culture find themselves to racialize their claims and to speak more of African culture than of national culture will tend to lead them up a blind alley. Oh, let's talk. Let's go up higher than that. Everywhere, however, in the Arab world, national feeling has preserved even under colonial domination and liveliness that we fail to find in Africa. At the same time, that spontaneous communion with each and all, of each and with all present in the African movement is not to be found in the Arab League. On contrary, paradoxically, everyone tries to sing the praises of the achievements of his nation. The cultural process is freed from the indifferentiation which characterized its African world. But okay, still talking about Arabs. Well, okay, let me skip the Arabic part. But the historic necessity in which the men of African culture find themselves to racialize their claims and to speak more of African culture than that of national culture will tend to lead them up. Now he's talking about the disadvantages of Pan-Africanism. Let us take, for example, the case of African Cultural Society. This society has been created by African intellectuals who wish to get to know each other and to compare their experiences and the results of their respective research and work. The aim of this society was to therefore affirm the existence of African culture and to evaluate this culture on the plane of distinct nations and to reveal that to reveal the internal motives of each of their national cultures. But at the same time, this society fulfilled another need, the need to exist side by side with European cultural society, which threatened to transform itself into a universal cultural society. Therefore, at the bottom of this decision, the anxiety to be present at the universal trusting. So, okay, let me not, a lot of complicated words, but what he's saying is because at that time, European culture was threatening to be the universal culture, which at some point it kind of is right now. But at that point, they were an equal and opposite. You know, I think sometimes it's like physics, you know, when you push, maybe, you know, is it Newton's third law? Where, but yeah, I forgot, I can't state it better, but think something about an equal and opposing force. When you push, like against a wall, an equal and opposing force is pushing against you back. So this is what I'm seeing with European culture. When they are pushing their culture towards Africa, Africa felt the need, or any object really, as Newton's third law, an equal and opposing force pushed back. Look at me, I quoted Isaac Newton. Tanzan. So now this society will quickly show its inability to shoulder these different tasks and will limit itself to exhibitionist demonstration. While the habitual behavior of the members of this society will be confined to showing Europeans that such a thing as African culture exists, and opposing the ideas to those of ostentatious, narcissistic Europeans, we have shown that such an attitude is normal and draws its legitimacy from the lies propagated by men of Western culture. But the degradation of the aims of this society will become more marked with the elaboration of the concept of negritude. African society will become cultural society of the Black world and will come to include Negro dispersion. That is to say, tens of thousands of Black people spread over. So basically, African culture now became Black culture globally. The Negroes who live in the US, Latin America, in fact, experience the need to attach themselves to this cultural matrix. Their problem is not fundamentally different from that of Africans. The whites of America did not mete out to them any different treatment. So the whites of America and the white treated Black people in America the same way the whites of Africa. You know, basically Black people. So because of that, the same thing that united Africa, that the ostracization or the insult that Africa had no culture, it's the same insult that was given to Black people in America and in Latin America. So all of us all had that innate desire to demonstrate to the world that Africa, there is African culture, there is that transformed into Black culture, because we all had that same need. So it's just the birth of Pan-Africanism. During the first Congress of the African Cultural Society in 1956, the American Negroes of their own accord considered their problems from the same standpoint as those of their African brothers. Cultured Africans, speaking of African civilization, decreed that there should be a reasonable status within the state for those who had formerly been slaves. But little by little, American Negroes, now here's the problem, here's the shift. Little by little, American Negroes realized that essential problems confronting them were not the same problems that confronted African Negroes. The Negroes of Chicago only resembled the Nigerians and Tanganyikans in as far as they were all defined in relation to white people. But once this first comparison had been made and subjective feelings were assuaged, the American Negroes realized that the objective problems were fundamentally heterogeneous, meaning that American Negroes realized, okay, our problems and African problems, apart from white oppression, we have objectively different problems. So this is the first, one of the, like this is the blind alley he was talking about when it comes to Pan-Africanism. the test cases of civil liberty, whereby both whites and blacks in America try to drive back racial discrimination, have very little in common with their principles and objectives with the heroic fight of... So basically, the fight of Black Americans against... although, okay, I think I disagree with him a little bit, but he's talking about the fight for civil liberty in which African Americans had to fight racial discrimination is not the same as the guerrilla war Angolans had in their fight for independence, you know? So I don't know, I feel like they are similar, but thus during the Second Congress of the African Cultural Society, the American Negroes decided to create American Society for people of black cultures. Negritude therefore finds its first limitation in the phenomena which takes account of the formation of the historical character of men. Negro and African Negro broke up into different entities because men who wished to incarnate these cultures realized that every culture is first and foremost national, and that problems which kept Richard Wright and Langston Hughes on alert were fundamentally different from those which confront Leopold Senghor or Jomo Kenyatta. In the same way, certain Arab states, though, okay, yeah, I see the difference, because you see Africans were fighting for independence and self-determination. I think American Negroes were fighting for self-determination, right? They were fighting for I don't know, I think we're fighting for equality. So I think, yeah, to some point it might be two different types of fights. But okay, let's continue. Had nevertheless to realize that their geographical position and economic ties of their region were stronger than ever than the past that they wish to receive. Thus, we find today Arab states organically linked once more with societies which are Mediterranean in their culture. The fact that these states are submitted to modern pressure, to new channels of trade and network. Okay, it's talking about Arabs again. Thus we see the cultural problem as it sometimes exists in colonized countries runs the risk of giving rise to serious ambiguities. The lack of culture of the Negroes as proclaimed by colonialism and the inherent barbarity of the Arabs logically led to the exaltation of cultural manifestations which are not simply national but continental. One of them is, you see a lot of people still today claiming African culture. You know, like, just this morning in Brother Bitterman, the Bitter Medicine podcast, you're talking about is abortion African culture. So, you know, you see, I think that thing, that this problem that is probably 60 years old manifests, even still today, it manifests. When you try to define African culture, it starts becoming ambiguous. We have to be very ambiguous so that we accommodate everybody. So even when I say that abortion is actually practiced with a good number of African tribes, it causes friction. You know, in Africa, the movement of men of culture is a movement towards the Negro African culture or the Arab Muslim culture. It is not specifically towards national culture. Culture is becoming more and more cut off from the events of today. It finds its refuge beside a heart that glows with passionate emotion, and from the next, it always complicated big words over there, fancy words. If the action of the native intellectual is limited historically, there remains nevertheless the fact that it contributes greatly to upholding and justifying the action of politicians. It is true that attitude of the native intellectual sometimes takes on the aspect of a cult or of a religion. But if we really wish to analyze this attitude correctly, we will come to see that it is symptomatic of the intellectual realization of the danger that he's running in cutting his last moorings and breaking adrift from his people. This stated belief in a national culture is in fact a dent, despairing turning towards anything that will afford him secure anchorage. in order to ensure his salvation and to escape from the supremacy of the white man's culture, the native feels the need to turn backwards towards his own roots and lose himself into whatever costs in his own barbarous people, because he feels he is becoming estranged. This is to say that he feels like he is the living haunt of contradiction. He's contradicting himself. I have mentioned this. I've mentioned this by the way, guys. You know, if you see me in other panels, I've mentioned this. Like there is a contradiction, especially when I talk to diaspora. Like, you know, I always mention the contradiction that when you talk about Africans and your actions in your life and what you're trying to limit the African countries when they deal with white people, yet you live with the Mzungu dealing with them. There is always, you see, there's the living haunt of contradictions, which run the risk of becoming insurmountable. The native tears himself away from the swamp that may suck him down and accepts everything, decides to take all for granted and confirms everything, even though he may lose body and soul. The native finds that he is expected to answer for everything and to all corners, to all comers. He not only turns himself into the defender of his people's past, he is willing to be counted as one of them. And henceforward, he is even capable of laughing at his own past cowardice. This tearing away, painful and difficult though as it may be, is however necessary. If it is not accomplished, there will be serious psycho-effective injuries, and the result will be individuals without any anchor, without a horizon, with colorless, stateless, rootless, and a race of angels. It will be also quite normal to hear certain natives declare, I speak as a Senegalese, or now this is for Francophone Africa, I speak as a Senegalese and as a Frenchman. I speak as an Algerian and as a Frenchman. There are those who claim to be Black British. So they don't claim to be African, they speak as Black British, you know. So it's a very interesting thing. And you know, what I like about these books is that they are old. They think this book was written in the 50s. So it shows you that these things you're doing are not new. They're not new to this world. You know, they were being dealt with back then. I speak as an Algerian, and okay, the intellectual who is Arab, French, or Nigerian and English, when he comes up against the need to take on two nationalities, chooses, if he wants to remain true to himself, the negation of one of this determination. But most often, since they cannot or will not make a choice, such intellectuals gather together all the historical determining factors which have conditioned them and take up fundamentally a universal standpoint. This is because the native intellectual has thrown himself greedily upon Western culture, like adopted children who only stop investigating the new family framework at the moment when a minimum nucleus of security crystallizes in their psyche. Okay, is going deep into mental health. The native intellectual will try to make European culture his own, Black British. Okay, a good example is Black British. You hear them all the time. He will not be content to get to know he will now be content. No, he will not be content just with Shakespeare and Diderot or these other European art poets. He will bind them to his intelligence as, ooh. Not only will he get to know Shakespeare, Diderot, Rabelais, Adam Smith, Newton, he will bind them to his intelligence as closely as possible. At that moment, when the nationalist parties are mobilizing the people, even me, you've just seen, I've quoted Newton. At that moment, when nationalist parties are mobilizing the people in the name of national independence, the native intellectual sometimes spurns these acquisitions, which he suddenly feels makes him a stranger to his own land. It is always easier to proclaim rejection than actually reject. The intellectual who, through the medium of culture, has filtered into Western civilization, who has managed to become part of the body of European culture, in other words, who has exchanged his own culture for another, will come to realize that the cultural matrix, which now he wishes to assume since he is anxious to appear original, can hardly supply any figureheads with which will bear comparison with those so many in number and so great in prestige of occupying powers, of the occupying power. Basically, no matter how you claim to be British, no matter how you claim to be French, you start to see French culture and French history and French figures, and you don't see black people. So you don't appear to be original. And you see it yourself that, oh my God, you don't see yourself, you're not original to this culture. But that is what you want to be. So now you are stuck in this weird dilemma. We continue. History, of course, though nevertheless written by Westerners and to serve their purposes, will be able to evaluate from time to time certain periods of African past. But standing face to face with his country at the present time and observing clearly and objectively the events of today throughout the continent he wants to make his own, the intellectual is terrified by the void, the degradation and the savagery he sees. Now he feels that he must get away from the white culture. He must seek his culture elsewhere, anywhere at all. And if he fails to find the substance of culture of the same grandeur and scope as displayed by the white power, if he fails to find anything that can match European power or European culture, the native intellectual will very often fall back upon emotional attitudes and will develop a psychology with which dominated by exceptional sensitivity and so basically because if he fails to find anything that can match European power in his own culture, he's going to be now very emotionally sensitive. This withdrawal, which is due in the first instance to a begging of the question in his internal behavior, basically he withdraws into his own character. This sufficient explanation of the style of those native intellectuals who decide to give expression to his phrase of consciousness, with which, oh my God, man can talk about the same thing in 3 paragraphs. Let's see if you can speed this up. This style, which in its time astonished the peoples of the West. This sufficient explanation of the style of those native who decide to give expression to this phase of consciousness, which is in the process of being liberated. It is a harsh style full of images. Basically, it's just talking about how he withdraws into his consciousness because of that dilemma. This style, in which where does he move on? If in the world of poetry this movement reaches an unaccustomed heights, the fact remains that in the real world, the intellectual often follows up a blind alley. When at the height of his intercourse with his people, whatever they were or whatever they are, the intellectual decides to come down into the common path of real life. He only brings back from his adventuring formulas, which are sterile in the extreme. He sets a high value on the customs, traditions. Again, he doubles back on his culture, right? He sets a high value on customs, traditions, and appearances of his people. But his inevitable painful experience only seems to be a banal search for exoticism. The sari becomes sacred. The shoes that come from Paris and Italy are left. He leaves those shoes for pamputis. I don't know what pamputis are. While suddenly the language of the ruling power is felt to burn. It doesn't sound good. English doesn't sound. I'm guilty also. English doesn't sound good on your lips. It's like, no, I'm going to have to speak an African language. Finding your fellow countrymen sometimes means, in this phase, the will to be a nigger, not a nigger like all other niggers, but a real. This book was written in oh my God. The will to be a nigger, not a nigger like all other niggers, but a real nigger. A Negro, Car. Just the sort of nigger that a white man wants you to be. Oh, okay. Going back to your own people means to become a dirty wog, to go native as much as you want, as much as you can, to become unrecognizable and to cut off those wings that before had allowed you to grow. The native intellectual decides to make an inventory of the bad habits drawn from the colonial world and hastens to remind everyone of the good old customs of these people of the past, which he has decided that contains all the truth and goodness. So basically he says that his past, he's now hanging on to the old customs of his past, and to him, that is the gospel. That what his people did in the past are is good. Let me just quote him directly. It contains all the truth and all the goodness. The scandalized attitude with which the settlers who live in the colonial territories greet this new departure only serves to strengthen the native decision. When the colonialists who had tasted the sweets of their victory over these assimilated people realize that these men whom they considered saved souls are beginning to fall back in the ways of the nigger, the whole system totters. Every native won over, every native who had taken the pledge, not only marks a failure for the colonial structure when he decides to lose himself and go back to his own side, but also stands as a symbol for the uselessness and the shallowness of all the work that had been accomplished. Each native who goes back over the line is a radical condemnation of the methods of the regime. So basically, every black person who goes back to his culture, who was formerly colonized in his mental, who was neo-colonized, every black person who decolonizes actually hurts the white supremacy. Because now, when you decolonize, it means that it becomes an unspoken declaration of the uselessness or the shallowness of white supremacy. So it's a very interesting dynamic we have here. If he wanted to trace the works of the native writers, in the first phase, the native intellectual gives proof that he has assimilated in the culture of the occupying power. His writings correspond point by point with those of his opposite numbers in the mother country. His inspiration is European, and he wants to easily link up with these works with definite trends in literature of the mother country. This is the period of unqualified assimilation. Okay, he's talking about the phase. Actually, he's talking about the phase of decolonization. In the second phase, we find the native disturbed. He decides to remember what he is. This period is of creative work approximately corresponds to that of immersion, which we have just described. But since the native is not part of his people, since he only has exterior relations with his people, he is content to recall their lives only. Past happenings of the bygone days of his childhood will be brought up out of the depths of his memory. Old legends brought up out of the depths of his memory. And basically that's the second phase of decolonization. Sometimes his literature, just before the battle, is dominated by humor and allegory. But often too, it is symptomatic of a period of distress and difficulty where death is experienced and disgust too. Finally, the third phase, which is called the fighting phase, the native after having tried to lose himself in the people and with the people, will only, on the contrary, shake the people. Instead of according the people's lethargy an honored place in his esteem, he turns himself into an awakener of the people. Hence becomes a fighting literature, a revolutionary. That's basically becomes a revolutionary. During this phase, a great many men and women who were up till the world will never have thought of producing literary work, now they find themselves, in prison and, become basically the consequences of revolutionaries. The native intellectual, nevertheless, sooner or later will realize that you do not have to show proof of your nation from its culture, but that you substantiate its existence in the fight with which the people wage against the forces of occupation. No colonial system draws its justification from the fact that the territories it dominates are culturally non-existent. You will never make colonialism blush for shame by spreading out little-known cultural treasures under its eyes. At the very moment when the native intellectual is anxiously trying to create a cultural work, he fails to realize that he is utilizing techniques and language which are borrowed from the stranger in his country. He contents himself with stamping these instruments with the hallmark which he wishes to be national. But which is strangely reminiscent of exoticism. The native intellectual who comes from with, okay, let me see. Just talking about the intellectual. I think I'm almost done here. Okay, yeah. I think we're in the final. All that made up the technique of passive. Okay. In an underdeveloped country during this period of struggle of traditions, this is why the intellectual runs the risk of being out of date. The people who have carried on the struggle are more and more impervious to demagogy, and those who wish to follow them reveal themselves as nothing more than common opportunists. In other words, latecomers. In the sphere of okay. This is not what I wanted. Where is it? It's talking about the artists in the realm of poetry established. The poet is it's about poetry, the native poet. Yes, the first duty of the native poet is to clearly see that his people are chosen as a subject of his work. I'm looking for the last part of decolonization. This guy literally writes a poem in his book. Okay. To fight national culture means, in the first place, to fight for the liberation of the nation. That material keystone which makes the building of a culture possible. There is no other fight for culture which can develop apart from a popular. This takes an example of men and women. Algeria. Okay. There's a part I wanted to finish where the native just now completely accepts. I don't think I'm going to find it here though. In 1959, the cultured Africans who met at Rome never stopped talking about unity. I think I've passed it. But yeah, welcome I Can Fire, welcome Tanzan, welcome Americans First. Americans, yeah, welcome, yeah, welcome. There's more work to do after decolonization, definitely. Welcome, Giram. Let me show you the part where I'm looking for the part. There's a part where the native intellectual accepts that he accepts something very important when it comes to decolonization. The colonized man writes for his people ought to use the past with the intention of opening the future as an invitation to action and a basis for hope. But to ensure that hope and to give it form, he must take part in action and throw himself body and soul into the national struggle. You may speak about everything under the sun, but when you decide to speak of that unique thing in a man's life that is represented by the fact of opening up new horizon and bringing light to your own country, and by raising yourself and your people to their feet, then you must collaborate on the physical plane. yeah, I think this is where I wanted us to look at as we finish. The responsibility of the native man of culture is not a responsibility of national culture, but global responsibility with the regard to the totality of the nation, whose culture merely, after all, represents one aspect of that nation. A cultured native should not concern himself with choosing the level on which he chooses to fight the sector where he decides to give the battle for his nation. To fight for national culture means that in the first place, you fight for the liberation of your nation. We must not therefore be content with delving into the past of the people in order to find coherent elements which will counteract colonialism attempts to falsify and harm. Okay, this is a very important point. So basically, don't look, okay, this is what he's saying. We must not therefore delve into the past of our people to find specific elements which will counteract colonialism's attempt to lie to us, you know. A national culture is not folklore. You know, it's not an abstract populism that believes it can discover people's true nature. It is not made up of inert dregs or gratuitous actions. That is to say that actions which are less and less attached to the ever-present reality of the people. A national culture is the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keep itself in existence. This is actually a very huge quote by Frantz Fanon. You'll see it, I've seen it a couple of times. So basically, he says national culture isn't just folklore or that's a weak culture. We talk about folklore or it's about the current struggles of the people at that moment, and if you want to get yourself attached to the national culture, you have to actually understand what are the struggles, especially in Africa. You have to ask yourself, what are the struggles of African people right now? Right now, what are their struggles? If you want, and that is the only way you will understand and will get to tap into national culture. So it's I actually agree with him. And he actually says that there is no common destiny to be shared between the national cultures of Senegal and Guinea, but there is a common destiny to be shared within the Senegalese and the Guinean nations, which are both dominated by the French colonialism. If it is wished that the national culture of Senegal should come to resemble the national culture of Guinea, it is not enough for the rulers of those two peoples to decide to consider their problems, whether their problems of liberation is concerned, or the trade union question or economic difficulties from similar viewpoints. Basically saying just because we may have similarities as nations, as African nations, we might have many similarities, especially when you're fighting colonialism. It doesn't mean that just because doesn't mean that our viewpoint should be the same. Doesn't mean that Kenya and Uganda should have the same viewpoint to its own problems. Just because we have a similar problems in fighting white supremacy doesn't mean that we should even have the same viewpoint to that problem. Because in according to Fanon, culture is national. To believe that it is possible to create a black culture is to forget that niggers are disappearing. Just as those people who brought them. Okay, this is a he really likes that word. But to believe that it is possible to create a black culture is to forget that niggers are disappearing, just as those people who brought them into being are seeing the breakup of the economic and cultural supremacy. So as white supremacy dies, he claims that as white supremacy dies, the nigger dies with it. And so we are left, what we are left with is different national cultures. Yes, that we are all black, but because with the death of white supremacy, I think he's predicting the death of black unity. The problem is to get to know the place that these men give up their people, the kind of social relations that they decide to set up, and the conception that they have for the future. I think I'm done. Yeah, I think I'm done. It's been what? It's been 2 hours. I say that no speech making and no proclamation concerning culture will turn us from our fundamental tasks. The liberation of national territory and the continual struggle against colonialism in its new forms, and an obstinate refusal to enter the charmed circle of mutual admiration at the summit. Okay, I think I'm done. Yeah. There's a part I wanted to show, but it's like I can't find it. So, but I think we've already reached the conclusion of this big chapter. It went longer than I thought, though. The chapter I wanted, yeah, like, but to me, if you're going to ask me the problems of Africa right now, the problems of Africa are simple. The problems of Africa is poverty. I think if you address poverty, if you address food security, those are the problems that Africans are, and are a definition of African culture. If you hear, like, there's nothing wrong with admiring the past, but you admire the past to open a way for the future. And I think in the Bitterman podcast, I think there was a question that the brother asked, that should we look for the past? Should Africa go back to the past? And that question comes from actually this part we're talking about, and I'm saying no. And I said, no, we should not go back to the past. I'm not saying we should ignore the past, but we should use the past to open opportunities and creativity for the future. But we should never, ever attempt to go back, because culture is dynamic. That's the part I wanted to see, but I haven't seen it. Culture is dynamic. I don't know. Let me see if I can search for it. Dynamic. But basically, that's the point that Frantz Fanon was trying to make at some point here, that culture is in its nature dynamic. Oh no, this is concerning violence. Dynamic, heterogenistic, bourgeoisie, dynamic. Dynamic power, cultural dynamics to give fresh input. Man, I'm done. So thank you guys for coming in and bearing with me from this long read of colonization, decolonizing the mind. The book, for those who wish to read the book further, the book is called The Wretched Earth by Frantz Fanon. Let me just put it on the comment section. And I'm going to play that video once more for those who have come in late. And hopefully you can see it now from the perspective of this book. See what our African brothers and sisters are saying.
This week on the 77% Street Debate.
I'll never be sad about being colonized by the British. Of all the colonizers, had we been colonized like by the Belgians, they didn't give a damn.
I'm about to give up. When I hear people talk about they don't have a problem with having been colonized, I question, how deep are you in this neo-colonial struggle that you've actually embraced your abuser and made her feel that she was right for doing what they did to you?
The 77% is in Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. And it is in this city that nearly 57 years ago, the flag went up. We were declared independent. But how independent is Kenya and indeed the rest of Africa? This is the question that we're asking today on our subject, neocolonialism. Why is it still a thing in Africa and who is to blame? But before we go too far, let's come to Nangela, who is a political analyst and a writer here in Kenya. How would you describe neocolonialism? What does it mean to you?
I think that Kwame Nkrumah gave us the best definition for neocolonialism, which is late stage imperialism. Because when we had direct imperialism, what you had is foreign countries having direct control, influence over people's economy, people's labor, people's freedom of speech, freedom of association. But with neocolonialism, what you have is indirect influence of political decision making, of economic decision making. That's how he defines neocolonialism. It's the benchmark for how we understand what's happening in a lot of the world that was sort of coming out of the colonial process.
Okay, I have a question for the audience. I just want to rope you in really early on, and I think it's important that we address this. We are Deutsche Welle. This is Germany's international broadcaster, and I'm here as an African. Am I a function and a tool of neocolonialism?
Just because you moved from, let's say, an African station to like a wider broadcaster does not make you a tool for neocolonialism, only in the sense that your talent is letting you tell, like right now, a black story within a predominantly, assume, white dosh world. So that does not make you a tool. One becomes a tool when there are direct interest of a neocolonizer.
Okay, so let me come to the farmer right here, Mr. Michael Kibinge, because your farm, as you mentioned, is over 100 years old, certainly older than the nation of Kenya. Do you feel like you're beholden to the person who began this farm?
Absolutely not, Edith. There's a famous Kenyan author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote a book, Decolonizing the Mind.
Yes.
And I believe we need to both decolonize our minds and our hearts as Kenyans. 56 years plus after independence, we really shouldn't be complaining too much about neocolonialism. Within the context of the coffee subsector, 4 years ago, we started what is called coffee tourism. So we invite tourists to come and see how it's processed, and then they get an opportunity to taste our brands. And that allows us to charge a fee for the tourism component and sell our coffee on farm.
Okay. Let me come back to Nangela, because I want to challenge you basically based on what Michael has said, that it's been about 56 years. We shouldn't be talking about neocolonization right now. Look at me and Fairview Farm. We're doing it on our own.
When we're talking about colonization and we're talking about imperialism, we're not talking about individual experiences. We're talking about a systemic issue. Yes, you're able to grow your coffee and run your coffee tours, but is the price, for example, that you're selling your coffee at reflective of the labor that has gone into producing that coffee, or is it reflective of political priorities that have been set elsewhere? Is it somewhere else saying that because you're an African country, your role is to produce, and especially to produce raw materials? And those are all questions of power and power disparities, and power disparities, exploitation of power disparities for the profit of certain regions, certain parts of the world, is the very definition of neocolonialism.
Okay, I'd like to come to Schaefer, because I just want to, piggyback on what Nangela is saying, that it is a system and it is exploitative. But where are our politicians, the people who should be at those international tables making better deals for us, saying this doesn't work for us anymore?
Kenya struggles with the cancer of political leadership that is dysfunctional, that is exploitative, that it's violent, that's discriminatory. There's also this culture that stems from a neo-colonial space of leadership that excludes people from their leaders, which is putting the people into this vicious circle of constantly saying, we need better, but nothing ever changes because the bubble and the shield of neocolonialism is so thick.
So we're saying that, oh my goodness, that neocolonialism, once again, is seeping into basically every single factor of our lives, politically, economically, even how we think, socially. And Mordecai Ogada, I really want to know what your take is on that. So as a conservationist, you have a very unique idea, which is that even narratives around Africa have been hijacked by Westerners. Can you talk to me about this?
The neo-colony or the new colony is not necessarily a physical space. It's a mental space. And we are so deep in it that even our top government structures cannot sort of fathom how deep we are in it. That's why we have a Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife, because what conservation is a principle and tourism is a business. Conservation of wildlife is about our heritage. It's not about tourism. But this shows where it grew from. We still have the feeling that wildlife tourism is something we do for white people.
So do you think that this is because we have internalized neocolonialism so much that we have become perpetrators of neocolonialism?
Precisely.
It seems you're not the only one. There's somebody here. In fact, there's someone clapping. But you're saying, yeah, we are responsible for the neocolonialism that we are experiencing.
Whenever I'm having a conversation about neocolonialism, I want to start with decolonize thy mind, because it's all in the mind. I'm an LGBTQ person. And most of the time when I sit and look at the history of LGBTQ people, when our colonialists came into our country, they came with the laws and the constitution, which until today is still guiding us. But before that, we had our ways in which we did things. But you see, all these things are things that we were taught and then we internalized. And we started saying now, because this law came and it told us this, these are our new realities. But are they our realities? I'm not a Western person. I was born in Kenya, raised in Kenya. My realities are all from Kenya as a Kenyan child, as a child of this soil. But every other time, I have had to unlearn a lot of things to even accept my truth as a queer person.
So we'll get to the realpolitik around that in just a second. But I want to introduce Mutua Madheka now, because as a photographer, you've gone around the continent of Africa with your very fantastic project, if I may say, Unscrambling Africa. You know, when you said here that it's just as simple as decolonizing the mind, but I'm just wondering how important are perceptions, how important is who controls the narrative, and is that shifting?
So one of the most important things I think is that African artists, photographers, whatever they are, need to look more inside than outward while looking for inspiration for their work. Because most of the time you'll find that when we are guided by things like grants and fellowships, you'll find that anytime you look, somebody, probably someone white, somewhere deciding I want to give grants to African photographers to look at a certain topic, but a topic that I am interested in, not something that they're interested in. Earlier, you did mention about this being on DW and the idea that journalism and news and all that we were taught by the West. That means all our journalistic photography seeks to look like the journalistic photography. That means pictures by a KTN photographer will look like pictures by a DW photographer. Why? It's unnecessary. They are not the same people. They're not working in the same context. So I think the stories should be different.
Okay, Nanjala, I just want to come to you so that you can contextualize this for us. Why is this so important? Why is it important that artists, journalists who are within the continent of Africa are self-actualized, that they don't use the West as a model?
You know, we talk about consciousness. It's about the consciousness with which we move through the world. Are we moving through the world confidently assured of our place, our value, and our contribution to society? Or are we moving through the world with a consciousness that is somehow crippled, that we think that we are less than, and so we have to spend the rest of our lives trying to reassert our humanity?
Okay. And I'm just wondering from Tony, is this possible on a political sphere? I mean, I think we all heard the former AU ambassador to the US being very, very angry about the fact that some French countries still operate under a CFA. In what ways does neocolonialism still have an impact in the way we are governed?
I'll mention the French very briefly. The French have never mentally left Africa, ever. You can see what goes on with the Congolese. Like the highest glory of African evolution is to become a Frenchman or a mademoiselle. The French have never lost that mentality. Eh? But
one might argue that Kenyans have not lost that mentality. We are, after all, having this conversation in English.
No, but Kenya is a very different country. Eh? We may be confused there, but I want to address immediately our political leadership. All neocolonialism relies on somebody having the leader in their pocket. Eh? Look at the begging bowls we always have whenever Xi Jinping in Beijing calls. Eh?
In that case, is your gripe then with your own government or with the colonial government that created structures in which we are governed as we are?
That is very lazy. We're always trying to blame the British in 2020. Eh? We are always trying. All the time we keep complaining about white people, by which we mean European people. Eh? The truth is this. Right now in 2020, Edith, 2020 February 20, the neocolonizer is China.
All right, I'd like to get some more views on this side.
The problem came with the philosophical foundations of this country. Like, if we're talking about export, we didn't center Kenyans or the people who live in this land we are in. So what we're experiencing now is a result of what happened then. So the West is still to blame, but we reproduce what they did. They're to blame, but we are reproducing it. We internalized it. So we shouldn't really center them whenever we think about development. We shouldn't think about this being a tourist destination. We should be thinking about how we're going to eat, how we're going to make this country better.
That's a really good point. Any other person who wants to add on that?
Okay, I think the way Africans have always grown up, we always think that our problems can only be solved by the whites. Like, we have been blinded. Let's try to solve our problems on our own, because the whites, they want to make you feel that they are the people who can solve your problems.
Okay, but is it fair? Let me ask Schaefer here. Is it fair to sort of lump the whole Western world into, you know, they're the white saviors, they're trying to come and save us, we don't need their help? Is there a room for collaboration, or is it just going to be this bipolar dialogue?
Well, I think room for collaboration that existed, or that have been assumed to exist, has existed in their white terms. So even as we collaborate, we are collaborating within their own structures, within their own agreements, within their own engagements, within their own requirements, right? White people have always wanted to enforce and to carry forward their whiteness and their supremacy. We should be able to enforce and carry forward our blackness, our black supremacy. But it's never going to happen because we don't have the leadership that is capable to reimagine our own governance and engagements out of the frame that is not neocolonial.
Angela, but is it necessary to always have this white resentment? There's a game we are playing here, and sometimes I get tired of it. They say, oh, I want to take white grants, that I want something specific to us. Your government never, I've won a lot of these scholarships and so on. They're always white. But you tell your own story in your own way. I feel like, what's this white resentment? I'll never be sad about being colonized by the British, of all the colonizers, because history and, you know, we had this.
Please contextualize that.
I will never be sad, because that's the way, real politics of the way of history. Had we been colonized like by the Belgians, they didn't give a damn. But I'm not going to go and keep repenting about 1889. So, okay. So do you understand my point?
Yes. And I'd like to give, let me come to Schaefer, because she's so exhausted. Her hands are on her head.
I'm about to give up. Because the thing is this, right? So the context is, when I hear people talk about they don't have a problem with having been colonized, I question, how deep are you in this neo-colonial struggle that you've actually embraced your abuser and made her feel that she was right for doing what they did to you?
Tony is saying that the facts can't be changed, that the world order at the time was as it was.
The world order was white people stealing from Black Africans. That was the world order. I think sometimes we speak very carelessly and very casually about very fundamental things that have got us in the mess that we are, and I really don't appreciate it.
Okay, Tony, do you agree with the charge that you are so deeply neo-colonized yourself that you don't see why your utterances could have been?
That is absolute bollocks. Yeah. Let me use British language. So people say I'm more neo-colonized. That is bollocks. Because we are educated in this way. Yeah, it's like those people who fail in life and keep talking about how their father was an alcoholic or their mother never loved them enough. And we like that. We must lose the victim mentality about the British especially, which we have in this country.
We started with a very critical question. Neocolonialism, why is it still in Africa? Well, the answer is in our history. And who is to blame for it? Apparently, we all are. Thank you for watching.
Well, thank you for coming, my brothers and sisters in the African congregation here that we had. Yeah, thank you for the 2 hours of your time, man. It was a great. Yeah, welcome, Bwana Hazuki. No, Bwana Haguzuki. Welcome to the stream, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Maria Antoinette. Thank you, Noel Brown, Dawit. Thank you, Tanzan. Thank you, American Raffleman. Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Let me get all your names, man. Regmond Music. Thank you, Regmond Music. Thank you, Yanatan. Thank you, I Can Fire. No, thank you, Giram. Thank you. I think I've gotten all of you. Neom Pax. And Ethiopia Tube, yeah. David Poons, thank you, man. Thank you, Manden Yebikanda. Thank you for all joining, man. And I hope you guys learned something, because I actually learned something when I was talking about this stuff. I also learned. Thank you, Mariette. Thank you, Redwan Shafi. Thank you, Kaizo. Kaizo was also here for a minute. So thank you, guys. And you guys have a very. Let me end with a word of prayer. Thank you to my brother. We have to create a hashtag to fight these things that we all talk about every day. Yeah. Yes, we do. So let me finish with the word of prayer. And Heavenly Father, thank you for this congregation that we've met here. Thank you for Swahili Nation. And it's a beautiful night thank you for this beautiful night, beautiful day, and this beautiful life. We pray for people to have good health and good living. All of us, in your holy name, we pray and believe in. From the motherland, amen. Good night, guys. It's been an honor.